So real quick before the video starts, if you guys enjoy it, remember to leave a like, and if you want to see more like it, remember to subscribe. Anyway, today we're back on Miner's Haven once again, and we're going to be continuing on with the tier lists. This is the second tier list video, and if you saw any in between now, you are misremembering. But yeah, we're going to be taking a look at every single fusion item in the game, and we're going to be ranking them from the best down to the worst. I know a lot of people wanted to see the superstitious tier list video, and I'm still going to be making that. I haven't forgotten or anything, but I'm waiting for the birthday update because we're getting a superstitious item in that update. And you know, I'd like my video to be up to date for at least a week or two. I don't want it to be outdated in a day. Also, one other thing, I want to give a shout out to my friend Gold Sierra, who randomly bought me Discord Nitro last night, which was pretty cool. He said he wanted a shout out, and I don't know how serious he was being, but there you go. There's your shout out. Anyway, not going to waste any more time. Let's start talking about the fusion, starting off with the Catalyzed Star. Catalyzed Star is a fusion between the Catalyst and the Morning Star, and this thing, as of right now, I feel like is definitely kind of low tier. Not the worst, and it's definitely usable. It has a base 5x multiplier, and then it can be looped like a star, but the star loop effect really isn't that good. It's a very low multiplier for the space that it takes up, and it's really just not as good as it used to be. It can be used, and it's not horrible, but it's really not a great item either. It's definitely bottom tier for sure. Next up, we've got the Dragonglass Blaster, a fusion between the Dragonglass Mine and the Dragon Blaster. It works like a standard blaster, but it has a pretty big explosion radius, pretty big boy explosions. Got a decent multiplier at 9x though, and I think this actually falls into the good category because while it's not the most useful, especially in the late game, this thing is actually a pretty good mid-tier item. And by mid-tier, I of course mean mid-game, because this thing is a very good alternative to the Hydra Blaster for going for centillions. If you need a blaster to loop, this thing is a nice, safer alternative. It's a little bit slower, but it can definitely still be very useful. Next up, the Azure Spore, a fusion between the Azure Refiner and the Wild Spore. And this thing used to be another fusion that was really good, but now it's kind of low-tier bad, I would say. Definitely not horrible, same thing as the Cata Star, basically, where it's usable, and it's got not horrible effects, but it got reworked to kill ores with sparkles now, so it's not that great. It does have a higher multiplier, so if you are using it, if you're a bit of a lower life or don't care as much about space efficiency, it's really not that bad, but it's not really a meta item anymore. It's really not that good in the first place. I would say lowish tier, bad item. Next up, the Diamond Breech Loader, a fusion between the Massive Diamond Mine and the Breech Loader. It shares the effects of the Massive Diamond Mine and the Breech Loader, where it gets random duplicated ores. And it also apparently works with Cell Furnaces now, which is a change that must have come in Reincarnation, which is pretty nice. I don't have much experience with this item in Reincarnation as of recent. It used to be very good, but just going off intuition, I would say this is probably another low-tier item. Not bad early game, especially if you can get it relatively early on, but you can pretty quickly beat it out with other mines, and it's kind of annoying to use, got some downsides. Definitely not the worst, it's usable, and it's not terrible, but it's also not great. It can definitely be beat out. I would say it's probably low tier. Might be wrong on this. If you have better experiences with this thing in Reincarnation, let me know, but that's just what I think of it going by its stats. Next up, we've got the Quantum Clockwork. This is a fusion between the Quantum Ore Cleaner and the Clockwork. Got two separate upgrades, and they combine for a total of 120 times, and this thing is easily S tier without a question. This is just an item that's good all around, no matter where you're at in the game. You get it early on, very high multiplier, relatively easy to craft, and it's very small. It's got great MPU, it's a really solid item. The only real downside, if you could really consider it that, is you have to hit both upgrader beams, and it's got a centered beam, but those are really easy to overcome, and this thing is just a top tier upgrader. It is extremely powerful, especially for how easy it is to craft. Next up, we've got an item on the opposite end of that spectrum, the Ether Schrodinger. This is a fusion between the Flaming Schrodinger and the Ether Refinery. It's got the randomness of the Schrodinger, and it's got the waiting and ore gate effect of the Ether Refinery. And this item is just terrible. It is really not useful in almost any regard. I can't think of a situation where you would want to craft and use this thing. We got plenty of Schrodingers, we've got plenty of better alternatives. This thing really just kind of sucks. Too slow, super annoying to use, the randomness isn't great, it's just bad. Next up, the Eternal Fracture. This is a fusion between the Eternal Journey and the Fracture, and this thing is the same as the Ether Schrodinger. This thing is just not good at all. It is a cell furnace that takes 15 seconds or however long to process your ore. The only redeeming quality of this item used to be that it was good for RP farming, but now it doesn't even have that because all of the RP changes made this thing pretty useless. So this thing, bottom tier, horrible item, not worth crafting unless you're going for a catalyst. Next up, we've got the Lightning Bolt Predictor. This is a fusion between the Astral Predictor and the Lightning Bolt Refiner. And this thing is just not a great upgrader anymore. It used to be pretty decent, but now that we've got the Astral Setter and the Lightning Bolt Refiner, and by the Lightning Bolt Refiner, I mean the Tempest Refiner, this thing has become a lot worse. The button activated, which is annoying, and if you're going to be using items like this, Astral Setter is a way better multiplier on its own, and then you can also use the Tempest Refiner with it. It's not horrible, it's usable, I guess, but it's really not great. It's not really worth crafting or using all that much. It still falls in the good tier because you can use it and it can be a good multiplier still. But yeah, this thing's not very good. Moving on, we've got the Frozen Eclipse. This is a fusion between the Gate of Eclipse and the Frozen Justice, and this is actually a pretty good upgrader. I would go as far as to say it falls in the good tier of items. Maybe I'm overrating it a little bit, but it's got a pretty good multiplier. Got rework so it works differently in the day and night. It's a 20 times at day, 40 times at night, and it also gives bonuses to flaming and sparkling ores. Big upgrader beam. It's a big upgrader, not the most space efficient, but it's still pretty solid. Definitely good for lower life players, and it can even find its way into resetter lines if you're using a railgun for automatic resetting. Fits nicely in there, and it is a solid upgrader. Next up, the Sage Justice, a fusion between the Sage Redeemer and the Blind Justice, and this thing I think falls in the good tier. Now, you may be confused by this because it's a pretty terrible item stats-wise. It's not a great cell furnace, it's definitely beat out, and as a regular furnace, it is one of the worst in the game. The reason I put it in the good tier, though, is because this thing has somehow found its way into the meta for most high life players. Reason being, it's still got a decent enough multiplier, it gets you enough to buy basically anything you need from the shop. A lot smaller, and you don't have to wait to get money for it to work effectively like you do with the Anguish. So it's not a good item still necessarily, but it's found its way into the meta and it does have its benefits and uses, so I think it's good tier just because it gets used quite often. Next up, we've got the Korpi Mine, a fusion between the Scorpium and Symmetrium Mine. This thing sucks. It is not a good mine. Scorpium is bad, Symmetrium is already kind of bad. Symmetrite is a much better item. It's just basically a direct upgrade to this. Scorpium sucks. Useless, no point never having it. Next up, the Dark Illuminator, a fusion between the Dark Magic and the Aura Illuminator, and this is actually a very, very good furnace after reincarnation. I would say probably falls in the good tier. It's not the best in the game, but it's got a really good multiplier at 500 unpowered and 5,000 times powered. Very easy to craft. You can use blasters with it. It's very, very small. This thing is a great furnace. Still, at the end of the day, it gets beat out by some of the late game furnaces, but it's still very, very good, especially for when you can get it in the game. Next up, the Pizzalist, a fusion between the Catalyst and the Pizza Blaster, and this thing is another S tier upgrader in my opinion. Very small, got a 60 times multiplier, so it's very, very good. Big upgrader beam, which is helpful. And it's also very small on the side, so you can fit certain portables like Midas Blasters and other portables that you need, so this thing is just very, very good. Next, the Anguish Garden, a fusion between the Dreamer's Anguish and the Sakura Garden. And this thing I would say is probably kind of low tier. It's not great, it's not the worst, it's usable, but this thing really isn't that good of a furnace. It takes sort of the negatives of the Sakura Garden and just gives it a slightly higher multiplier. Kind of an furnace. I don't really like it or hate it too much, but it's kind of on the worst side in my opinion. Next up, another garden fusion. This is the Ambrosia Garden, fusion between the Sakura Garden and the Ambrosia Fountain. This thing has the wait time of the Ambrosia Garden and the effects of the Sakura Garden again, and this thing I would say is probably on the same tier as the Anguish Guardian. Your ores have to be around for 10 minutes to get the max multiplier, but if they're around for a few minutes, or if you're doing a Centillion setup or something, this thing isn't terrible, but outside of that, you're really not going to see any use of this thing. It does serve somewhat of a purpose, I guess. It can be used, but again, it's really not that good. It's usable, but not great. Next up, the Fire Crystallized System, a fusion between the Fire Crystal Mine and the Crystallized System. Requires coal for it to work, and this thing I would say is a pretty decent upgrader. I think, honestly, it can go in the good tier, because it's not great, it's not top tier, but it's still solid. It's got a decent enough multiplier. An upgrade to the Crystal System or its Evo at around 12 times. Big upgrader beam, relatively small. This thing is just solid. Goes in the good tier, in my opinion. Next up, the Nature's Temple, a fusion between the Nature's Grip and the Ancient Temple. And this item has either a 30 trillion or 50 quadrillion times multiplier. I haven't actually gotten too much use out of it, or don't know if it's very good, but it definitely seems viable, and it seems like it's somewhat easy to get early on as well. So I'm going to put this thing in the good tier. I might be wrong on that ranking. I really haven't gotten too much use or experience with this thing, so if you have any experience or ideas with it, let me know. I feel like I don't have enough knowledge to properly rank this, so I'm just throwing it in the mid tier. Next up, the Illuminator Evaluator, a fusion between the Schrodinger and the Illuminator. But struggling to get that one out. This thing is a decent upgrader, though. This thing, as just a regular Schrodinger, not very good, but if you use it with the Void Drive and the Desert Monument, not terrible, and it's also relatively small, so I think I'm going to put this thing in the mid tier as well. Another item that I don't have a lot of experience with, and I can't see it being used too much outside of Void lines, but if you're using the Void Drive, this thing could be a little bit better for it. Actually, considering the usefulness of the Void Drive and all that, I think I'm actually going to move it down a tier. I'm going to bump it down to the lowest tier. Because outside of the Void Drive, it's not very good, I don't think, and even with the Void Drive is kind of outclassed, so while this thing is the best Schrodinger for it, it's still not great. I think that deserves moving down a tier. Next up, the Untonium Mine. This is a fusion between Unium and Newtonium. The build takes a lot of inspiration from the Newtonium Mine, and this thing has benefits from both items. Decent ore value, but I think this thing, again, falls in kind of the mid-range. This is another item I haven't really had experience with. This seems like it's definitely an item meant for lower lives, so if you have experience with this thing, once again, let me know your experiences with the item and if it's actually a little bit better or worse than I'm ranking it. Seems decent enough at the low lives, relatively easy to craft, so I think this thing could be pretty good, but I just don't know enough about it to rank it properly. Next, the Anguish Guardian of the Gate. This is a fusion between the Guardian of the Gate and the Dreamer's Anguish. Functions as a regular furnace instead of a cell furnace. Gives a multiplier based on if the player is on their base, and also how much money you have, working like the both items, as you would expect from a fusion. And this item, I think, I'm gonna put it in the good tier again. This thing is a little bit harder to craft. It takes a couple of rarer items. Slightly rarer, at least. And it's not a great furnace, but I think it definitely can be useful. It's got a pretty solid multiplier as well. It has a pretty high max, capping at over 20,000 times, which is not terrible. Definitely not a great furnace, but it's a pretty useful item still. It can be, at least. Again, another item I don't have a lot of experience with, but I say it kind of falls in the good tier based on stats. Next up, I'll do these as a package deal. We've got the Phase Cursor Furnace and the Phase Cursor Mine. This is a set of items which fuses the Phase set and the Precursor set, and I think these items have about the same usefulness as both of those, that being none. Both of these take relatively rare items with needing Precursor sets and also the Phase stuff, and they're just not very good. You have to power them up, not great enough multipliers for what they do. The Mine as a standalone item is not good, same with the Furnace, and even when you're working with everything you need, it's just not worth it. It's too much effort, these are bad, you're never gonna see them used. Next up, we've got the Igneous Lightning. This is a fusion between the Igneous Forge and the Arcane Lightning. It works in a similar way, but you don't have to button power it, you just have to power it with coal. It has a max multiplier of around 120 times, and honestly, out of the fusions, I'd say this thing is probably top tier. It's not quite meta anymore, even though it is still a pretty good upgrader. It's relatively space efficient, though on slightly lower end. It's a very good upgrader. I think it definitely belongs in the S tier. Next up, the Virtual Gearwork, a fusion between the Virtual Refiner and the Gravitational Gearwork. It takes the hydraulics of the gearwork and the multiplier of the virtual and combines it into one, and this thing is actually a really good item. I think it belongs in the S tier as well. May come as a surprise considering it's got a relatively low multiplier compared to some of the others, but it's actually a very space efficient and really useful upgrader. You can use it very easily with railgun cannons. You can use certain items under it like the Son of Poison, and it's just generally a really good item. Maybe not everyone will agree that it's S tier, but I think it's still a great upgrader and definitely deserves the spot. Moving on to our last two, both Pulsars, starting off with the Stardust Illuminator. And this item on its own is not good. This thing on its own as an individual item is pretty terrible. I would probably put it either in the low tier or the useless tier. However, I'm actually going to put it in the good tier, and this is because of one thing and one thing only, the Guard Core. This thing paired with the Guard Core becomes an incredible upgrader. It gives you the ability to instantly use the Indoctrinator, and that is a very, very high multiplier, and that thing bumps this item up quite a bit. I think putting it in S tier is a little bit too much, especially considering people have gone to the Hypernova now, but this thing still has quite a bit of usefulness paired with the Guard Core. Certainly not the best item in the game, but it definitely has its usefulness. As a standalone item, it still kind of sucks though, so, you know, probably don't go for this thing just on its own. And finally, we've got the Ore Nova. This thing is a fusion between the Nova Star and the Stardust Illuminator. Not Illuminator, the Stardust Pulsar. This thing is essentially a Nova Star Pulsar, and it gives all of your ores on your base the effect of the Nova Star. And this thing, you might be able to guess where it's going considering the usefulness of stars as of recent. This thing is a pretty useless item nowadays. Stars are not good anymore, and this thing being a Pulsar star item really doesn't help anything. It doesn't give its own individual upgrade, and it's just not very useful right now. If stars were a little bit better, then maybe this thing would be more meta. Maybe you would see this more to save space from the Nova Star, but it's really just not good. Anyway, though, that's all of the fusions in the game. I'll give you a nice flyover and look at all of the rankings. You might agree or disagree with a lot of these. Let me know in the comments. I don't have proper experience with a lot of them, so I'm sure a lot of you guys have different opinions, and maybe you can correct me on a lot of these placements because I'm sure they're not perfect. A lot of these fusions I haven't gotten use out of since they're more mid to early game items, a lot of them. So yeah, if you disagree with my choices, then let me know why in the comments. Anyway, though, that's all I've got for this video. Thank you for watching. Hope you found it useful. If you enjoyed it and you want to stay in touch with me, check out my Discord server or my Twitter. I also have a Roblox group where I'm gonna sell merch eventually. I'll get around to it, I swear. And also, you can check out the music in this video. Anyway, though, that's all I've got for this one. I'm gonna head out now. Peace out, everyone.